Thank you so much for those who are joining us on Zoom today. I think, I hope you can see me as you do. Okay, so I'd like to contribute with this paper to the anthropology of ethics today. And the topic has, or the title has slightly changed from what it says in the abstract. The title of the paper today is Pluralism and Ethical Change, views from Southern Ethiopia. So as you will be aware, the anthropology has been a kind of growing and flourishing subfield of anthropology over the past 15 years or so, and has looked at a whole host of topics. But one topic which hasn't received so much attention is the topic of ethical change. And by that, I don't mean that anthropologists haven't talked about change on a descriptive level in their ethnographies. But what I mean is that few, with a few exceptions like Joel Robbins or Red Keen, few have offered us explanatory accounts of ethical change. And obviously, ethical life does change, so it would be good to have some sort of systematic ideas on how that happens. And so today I'll try to offer you one sort of theoretical account. Okay, so what do I mean by ethical change? By ethics, to begin with, I mean the whole host of considerations which people have about the question, how is it to live well? And that includes the obligations that I have toward other people. It includes ideas about what sort of person I should aspire to be. And it includes ideas about what sort of communal relations are worth desiring. And so by ethical change, then, I would understand a change both in the ideas about what sort of life is worth living and in the practices and institutions through which people try to realize those ideas. So basically, I would think of ethical change as a shift from one way of life to another way of life. So it's a fairly kind of profound sort of cultural change of work. Okay, so if we think about ethical change, there are obviously various different types which we may want to distinguish. So sometimes ethical change happens very slowly, right? It takes several generations or even centuries. And that's the sort of change which people often don't really notice while it happens, but which they only kind of take notice of afterwards, looking back to earlier times and becoming aware how much things have changed. And here one might think, for instance, of the works of Louis de Moore, the rise of individualism in the West, or of the work which Charles Taylor has done on of these modern ethics of authenticity in his work on the sources of the self. But sometimes ethics change much more rapidly within a single generation, such that people who were brought up in one way of life take on another way of life. And that obviously requires a different sort of explanatory approach, and that's what I'm looking at today, so a rapid sort of ethical change. And here again, one probably wants to distinguish between cases where ethical change is a result of force, where people are in some way coerced to give up an established way of life, be that due to colonial conquest or climate change making it impossible to go on pursuing a certain livelihood, or as in the work of Joel Robbins, where people are humiliated so deeply that they kind of lose faith in the goodness of their established way of life, and then are driven to look out for new ways of being. But there are also cases where ethical change is more self-directed, where it grows out of people's own concerns and where it takes a more voluntary form. And so that's what I talk about today. So talk about kind of swift, self-motivated ethical change, right? Why is it that people sometimes take up entirely new ways of living? That's what I'll be talking about today. And so the central concept of my approach is the notion of value pluralism. And the main idea I want to get across is that value pluralism creates specific problems in human life, and people's efforts at dealing with those problems sometimes lead them to search for new ways of being. And I'll do that in two big steps. I'll first a theoretical section where I elaborate two models of how value pluralism can drive ethical change. And then I'll turn to my ethnography from Southern Ethiopia to illustrate the second of those models, which I'll present. Okay, so value pluralism as an abstract philosophical position really means two things, two interrelated things. The first is that there are several ultimate values in the world, meaning things which are intrinsically good, right? So things like beauty or truth or love or friendship or equality or freedom, you know, these high-level values. And the second proposition is that some of those values don't really fit together. They are incompatible. And that means that you can't pursue one of them without violating the other, right? You may come into situations where you have to decide for one or for the other, but you can't have both. And I think that's something that most of us will be familiar with as a concept. So one familiar example, for instance, would be this issue of equality and freedom, right? You can't kind of have perfect equality between people without limiting their liberty to a certain extent. Whereas if you grant kind of complete freedom and liberties, you'll end up with a certain amount of inequality, right? Take the US as an example of that. And there are also many other cases which we know from kind of our own life, where sometimes we may come into a conflict of keeping a promise to someone and helping someone in need, right? Maybe you're on your way to your best friend's wedding and you come across someone who had a bad accident, and then you're in a tough situation. Either you help that person, right? You keep, you live up to that values of helping others in need, or you keep the promise to your friend, but you can't have both. And that's the core idea of value pluralism, that we have these sorts of value conflicts in life. Now, I think that it's not a too, as it were, controversial position to say that value pluralism is a shared human predicament. So I think basically everywhere people value more than one thing, and they often come up against the need of having to make hard choices between that. Right? I mean, if anthropology has kind of been telling us one thing over the past 40, 50 years, it's that cultures are not perfectly integrated. We always have kind of different things at play which people need to negotiate. But to say that value pluralism is a universal phenomenon obviously doesn't say that it looks the same everywhere. So it can take different forms in different places. And that is something that Joel Robbins has drawn attention to in his 2013 article on this topic, where he describes how pluralism takes different forms in different societies. And to that, I would like to add the observation that pluralism also creates distinct kinds of problems. So the sort of problems pluralism creates, it's not always the same. There are different issues arising from it. And so what I'll do now is to kind of sketch two problems and say for each how it may lead into ethical change, how people's effort of dealing with those problems may lead them to transform their way of life. Okay. So in some places, in some settings, which Robbins calls ones which are marked by unsettled pluralism, people basically have to make hard choices all the time. So they frequently come into situations where it's unclear what value to act on. And then they have to make those hard choices. And the case of the Rahmen people of Papua New Guinea, which many of you may know from Robbins' work, it's a good example of that, where people are constantly drawn between either focusing on their individual salvation or engaging into the sort of interactions which are necessary for basically maintaining their subsistence in this world, and where that creates a whole lot of torment. And so I think the problem associated with this kind of setting is not simply that people often kind of have to choose one thing or the other, and that whatever they choose, they lose a good thing. The problem also is the very fact of having to make hard choices all the time. If you constantly have to decide for one thing or the other, that is agony, right? There's an agony of choice, and I would say that this agony of choice is one particular problem which pluralism creates. And I think that this agony of choice may be one starting point for ethical change, in as much as people may wish to overcome this agony, right? They may wish for a life without these sorts of value conflicts, where all the different values they recognize are in some sort of perfect harmony, and where they no longer have to make those hard choices. And this desire for unity then may set people on what I would call a quest for unity. And I think one good example of that is found in the work of Schielke. So Schielke writes about these young men who are constantly torn between romantic love and professional self-realization and being a son and honoring the community, religious piety. And Schielke tells us that some of these men are so in such a state of agony over that they turn to Salafism, which promises them explicitly that by making, in quoting Schielke, making Islam the key frame of identity and solidarity will provide for clarity in the face of confusion. So these men turn to Salafism and remodel their lives according to its precepts in an effort to overcome those hard choices which they have to make. And I think Max Weber, for instance, has also seen very clearly how this drive toward unity is a driver of ethical change. And here I'm referring to his work on charismatic prophets, obviously, who, so Weber tells us, arise in situations where people have to make these difficult choices, and then the prophets offer, here I quote again, the unified view of the world and a systematization of practical conduct. And in that way, by attracting people to follow them, by offering them this sort of unified view of the world, prophets on Weber's account become agents of ethical change, because to follow the prophet, obviously you have to kind of reorder your life along new lines, and so that leads to ethical change. And I think, you know, many kind of religious and political movements have obviously thrived on this promise of providing people a way out of value conflicts. But as we also know, many of those movements fail, right? And in Schielke's case, for instance, we see that very same failure of these young men in the end, you know, feeling the pull of other values which Salafism excludes, worldly values which continue to exercise attraction over them. And then they slowly drift away from Salafism and kind of return to the old way of life. And from a pluralist perspective, that of course is entirely unsurprising, right? Because on this view, it's just in the nature of things that you can't reconcile all values into sort of perfect harmony. That just doesn't work. But still, the strive toward unity, I would say, is one powerful motive in life, which is one driver of ethical change. And so that's the first model which I want to offer to you today. Oh, sorry. Okay. Now, obviously, it's not the case that people everywhere have to constantly make hard choices. Not everyone lives in this kind of Rahmen setting. And so there's a second type of pluralism, which Roberts calls stable pluralism. And that is where you have several distinct ultimate values, but where those values are arranged in such a way that they don't come into conflict in everyday life. And that may, for instance, happen by having different domains of action, levels of context of action, and each being associated with a particular value. So you may have a distinction between the public and the private sphere, with the public sphere being about maybe the quest for personal glory or competition, where things are distributed according to merit, where you have some sort of antagonism as a legitimate orientation to action. And you have maybe a private sphere where values of mutuality and love and reciprocity prevail. And so in those settings, from the outside, it may very well seem that there are no conflicts, right? People live their way of life. The way of life is organized in a particular way, which maybe from a Dumontian perspective looks like a sort of perfect hierarchy. But I think that from people's own point of view, that's not necessarily the case. And the reason why it is not necessarily the case is that if you have different ultimate values, people may feel the pull of those values and may wish for them to be more fully realized. So they can imaginatively conceive, for instance, what life would be like if those values of love and mutuality, which prevail in the private sphere, also dominated in public. And that's something which I would call the magnetism of the good, right? There is a constant attraction to the good, which gives people the desire to realize those values more fully. And so I think that this unfulfilled longing, which is created in situations of stable pluralism, is the second major problem which pluralism creates. So a yearning or a regret about certain values being constantly limited, and that this may become an entry point of ethical change. So it is a kind of disposition for a change because people can imagine that other values would be moved to the center of existence, that a good life could also be lived in the light of other values which are currently in subordinate position. And for this to actually lead to ethical change, there have to be feasible ideas or realistic alternatives how to reorganize life to give more space to those values. If you don't have those values, you won't be able to change your way of lifestyle. But once such alternatives or opportunities arise, people may be quite willing and desirous to embrace those opportunities to move those restricted values to the center of lifestyle. And I think especially in the places where we as anthropologists tend to work, those opportunities often arise in the form of new ideologies being promoted. And here I'm talking about things like Christianity or Islam or development or perhaps in the past socialism. And these ideologies offer certain visions of how life could be lived or how it could be lived differently, and they offer particular practices, institutions which are geared toward the realization of those visions. So they provide a kind of realistic alternative. And the crucial point for my argument is that the values which those ideologies elaborate very fully may be precisely those which are subordinating people's own tradition, their own cultural tradition. And so then seeing those values very fully elaborated, people may be motivated to engage those ideologies in an attempt to realize those values more fully. And so that's a second way, I think, in which pluralism can lead to change. Obviously, that's just a rough sketch. It's a model. And so it might be good to turn to some ethnography now and to try to flesh that out and maybe learn a bit more about this model by putting it in touch with empirical realities. How am I doing for time? Okay, so I did field work with the Ari people, who are subsistence farmers for the most part, living on the southwestern fringes of the Ethiopian highlands. And I carried out field work in an Ari community which is called Del, and which has a population of around about 4,000 people. And so in 2016 and 17, at the time of my main field work, there were three major groups in this community of Del. You had a little less than a third who were followers of the traditional system of practice and belief. You had a little bit less than 2/3 who were evangelical Christians, and these had all converted since the 1990s. And you had a very tiny group of Orthodox Christians. And these had only emerged since around 2010. And I know that I said in the abstract I would be going to say something about these Orthodox. Sadly, I won't have time for that, but I have a forthcoming article on them. So if you're interested in that part of the argument, I'll be happy to share that article with you if it would be a message. So I'll be talking about these evangelical Christians. And I begin by telling you why this engagement with evangelical Christianity constitutes an instance of ethical change as I began defining it at the outset of the paper. So it means moving from one way of life to another, and that of course is something which we're familiar with from many accounts of conversion. Becoming Christian means abandoning various practices and institutions. So you can't any longer marry several wives, you don't participate in lineage rituals, you disobey various taboos, you are not allowed to contract bond friendship. And Christianity is very opposed to feasting and alcohol and dancing. So, you know, everything that is fun is kind of looked at with a certain amount of suspicion. And then on the other hand, becoming Christian means taking up various new practices, institutions. So that ranges from new forms of greeting and speaking, to new forms of conflict resolution, new ways of organizing labor, new ways of doing such things as funerals and weddings. So Christianity has put into place this new way of life. And in the background of those various changes on the level of practice, we see certain changes in ideas about what a good life consists in and what sort of person one should aspire to be. And that change can be summarized by saying that there has been a move from honor to humility. So the pre-Christian way of life, or the traditional way of life, revolves around the pursuit of honor. The central idea here is to become a great person in life, or to become heavy, as Ari say, to make a name for oneself. And that is something which you do by accumulating wealth in people, by creating many dependents. It is something you do by taking public offices and by sponsoring big feasts for the community. And it bears saying that this is something that everyone does. So men and women do that, and also the poor and richer do it. And obviously people kind of have different chances in terms of, you know, accumulating honor or rising to honor, but still everyone tries to rise. So this pursuit of greatness is the animating idea of this pre-Christian way of life. Now for Christians, that's completely misguided. The quest for greatness for them contravenes what they read in the Bible about God giving favor to the humble person. So you shouldn't care about being admired by others, you shouldn't care about others showing you deference and signs of special respect, but you should make yourself small, as our Christians say, and you should lead a kind of quiet, pious life, be active in church, and then finally go to heaven, but you shouldn't strive for greatness. And it's also worth noting that the pursuit of honor is just no longer possible because Christianity has abolished all these institutions, right? You cannot any longer marry several wives, you cannot have bond friends, you cannot sponsor big feasts, because this way of life just doesn't make any room for it. So these routes to honor are foreclosed for Christians. Right, so I think we have a clear instance of ethical change here. People have moved from one way to the other. They have abandoned this life which is centered on honor, and they have taken up a life which is centered on humility. And the question, of course, is why, right? Why would you do that? Why? What is attractive about that? And so the claim I want to elaborate now is that what attracted people to Christianity was that Christianity offers them opportunities for realizing more fully the value which they have long cared about, which they also cared about in the past, but which was restricted in the past. And that's the value of social harmony, as I glossed. And social harmony in this pre-Christian way of life certainly means something like absence of conflicts, no quarreling, no fighting. But it also has a positive side, which means being in friendly interactions, having sort of warm relations, and just being sociable and convivial. So that is also part of this idea of social harmony. And obviously, harmony is something which you may find its value everywhere, right? Maybe no society could survive without placing some value in harmony. But here the contention is that for Ari, that is a high level value. That's one of those values which they have taken up and elaborated very fully, just as they have taken up and elaborated fully honor as a value. And this high value that is placed on harmony is indicated on the one hand by the fact that all illness and all other problems are explained as an outcome of disharmony. So if parents quarrel and fight with each other, children may fall ill and die. Or if there is disunity in the land, if people have been quarreling with each other, there may be epidemic disease or a lack of rain. So disharmony leads to suffering. But then on the other hand, you also have a lot of positive kind of energy being invested into maintaining and recreating harmonious relations. And that, of course, is another index for the value these people place on harmony. So there is, in this pre-Christian way of life, a big concern with politeness and self-control. There's much focus on hospitality and commensality, so eating together as a way of being in good harmonious relations. And there are various practices of kind of discovering conflicts before they build up and trying to dissolve social tensions through rituals. So we have these two main concerns with honor and social harmony in the pre-Christian way of life. And to some extent, those work together. So I'm not saying that these values exclude each other entirely. And in some ways they work together. So for instance, being a mediator is something that brings you honor, right? Being someone who is able to help other people solve their conflicts is highly esteemed. And so here we see how striving for honor at the same time helps to recreate social harmony. But there are also many ways in which honor and harmony conflict. About those I'll be telling you a little bit now. And I should say that, this conflict between honor and harmony is maybe not so surprising, because it's something that I think we tend to associate with honor cultures. There tends to be a fairly high level of aggressiveness or violence. And something like that we also find in this case. So the first way in which honor and harmony clash is that to gain honor, you need wealth. You need to buy bond friends, you need to sponsor these big feasts. And to get that wealth, people try to make use of their juniors, of their junior kin. So they will try to make a lot of labor demands on them or try to get wealth other ways. And to some extent, that's something that juniors are fine with, right? That's just a part of what it means to be a good son, for instance, to help your father plow his field every now and then. But juniors also want to rise in life. They also want to gain honor. And so there comes a point when juniors start getting a bit grumpy, right? Because they're just being asked all the time by seniors to carry out labor services, for instance. But then when they get grumpy, that obviously leads into conflicts, because seniors think, due to their elevated position, they're kind of have a right to those labor services. So these struggles over resources between kin are the first source of tension, which is related to this pursuit of honor. The second way has to do with people being very sensitive to insult, and that again is something which you, I think, find in many honor cultures, that people are quite quick to perceive something as a sign of disrespect, and they are quite ready to react to that, right? Because if you don't defend your honor, you lose it. That's a second source of disharmony. And you have various risky practices, as I call them for myself, which means that in many rituals you have interactions between seniors and juniors, where seniors kind of withhold things from juniors. Things that juniors need, like land or permission to marry, or some rituals that are to be carried out on behalf of juniors by seniors. And so by withholding those things, seniors want juniors to come begging, right? And if juniors come begging, that's a way of realizing your own honor very fully, because you appear as a kind of great man or as a great woman. And these practices are a form of cultural play, I suppose, but they are risky, because there often comes a point again where seniors kind of push things too far, and where, in an attempt to realize honor very fully, they end up sparking rebellion among their juniors. So then juniors get seriously upset, and again you come into some sort of conflict dynamic. And I think that resembles to some extent what Bateson describes by talking about schismogenesis, just a side note. Okay, so the competitive pursuit of honor tends to undermine social harmony. And to some extent, of course, people have a certain margin of maneuver of deciding whether to either try to maintain harmony or to really go for honor. But I think that it is ultimately a structural phenomenon. So the way in which this way of life is organized, the way in which the institutions work, honor tends to come out on top. It tends to trump harmony. It tends to constantly undermine harmony. Right. Okay, so much for the pre-Christian way of life. And I think that if you accept that argument, it won't take much to convince you that this Christian focus on humility really provides a kind of better cultural ground for realizing social harmony. Right? If honor is the main source of conflict, then surely doing away with honor and focusing on humility is going to offer more chances for harmony. And I think that's really what happens. So Christian rituals no longer involve those practices of withholding things from juniors. There's always an emphasis on giving in very quickly, on being lenient. People also don't expect so much in terms of respect, so they are less sensitive to disrespect. They are less ready to take offense. And Christianity has also abolished all these costly institutions on which people used to spend their wealth in the past. So there's less need to make all these aggressive demands on juniors to provide wealth or labor services. So that's how this focus on humility kind of supports social harmony. And you can add to that Christianity is also opposed to alcohol, and that, of course, is the second major source of conflict in society. And so this teetotalism here also supports the harmony associated with Christianity. And so that's really something that everyone in this community today agrees on, including the traditionalists, right? They say, yes, that's true. The Christian way of life is way more peaceful. So that's something that no one is in any doubt about. But obviously, you will be asking yourself, so how exactly did this happen historically, right? For instance, how did people first know that Christianity offers better chances for harmony? Because the argument I'm making is that this is what attracted people to Christianity, right? They were desirous to realize that value more fully. And so that led them to engage with Christianity. And here I think the crucial point is that the first people, they didn't know. So the first people who converted it in the late 1980s, and they had all been very ill for a long time. They were desperate for healing. And there were some rumors that you might get healed if you become a Christian. And so they tried that out as a kind of last-ditch attempt. And then some did get healed, and they became very committed and dedicated Christians in response to this experience of having been healed. And then set up their own small community, their own small church. And so my contention is that by living as Christians, by forming this small community, they represented to other people what harmony looks like, or what life looks like if you move harmony to the center of your attention. Right? So they had their own small Christian community, and then their neighbors would see that there was some sort of change in relations among those people. Or, for instance, attending Christian social events like funerals or weddings, which were also attended by people who followed the traditional way of life. These traditionalists saw the difference that Christianity makes in terms of the ethos or the tone of social relations. And that, again, is something that people really remember today, how when this small community first came into being, they were kind of quite astonished, as it were, by the difference in how relations worked among those Christians, and really felt, in a certain sense, this harmony. And that then in the following years attracted people more and more to join the Christian group, desirous to realize this value of harmony more fully. And I think that's a first insight which I can, as it were, add to my model, that we have here an avant-garde, right? There is a group of people who, for contingent reasons, engaged with Christianity. They didn't really know what they were buying into, but then they discovered the possibilities for harmony, and by living in that way, attracted others. So they became a sort of collective exemplar, which motivated others to join the Christian church. And I think that's something that you will often have, because just hearing about a certain way of life, or having missionaries or development experts talk about it, doesn't really create the attraction. You have to see it somewhere, right? You have to be able to feel the attractiveness of the values elaborated in a particular way of life. And so you will often have this sort of avant-garde. Okay, one question that you also might be asking yourself is, why hasn't everyone converted, right? If harmony is a shared value, and if Christianity is so harmonious, then why is there 1/3 of the population which continues following this pre-Christian life? And certainly one issue has to do with this renunciation of honor. So humility is perhaps not to everyone's taste, and especially to those in more senior positions. Humbling themselves is something which they find hard to conceive, as some told me. And so that is a kind of first reason that they don't want to renounce this quest for honor. But the real issue is elsewhere. The real issue, according to traditionalists, is that Christianity is too austere. So they point out that there's no feasting, and no dancing, and no drinking, and no fun. So it's a very austere kind of life. And especially for elderly men who have the time and the resources for engaging into this kind of conviviality, that is something that deters them. And also for the less educated youth, who have perhaps a slightly more hedonic take on life, that is also something that deters them from becoming Christian. So they say there is in a sense too little social intensity, there's too little conviviality. Now, the interesting thing is that the Christians agree with that as well. So they say, yes, that's true, that there is very little conviviality among us. And that, of course, raises the question, why don't they just feast more, right? I mean, why don't they do that? And indeed, in the beginning, the Christians still placed a higher value on feasting, and feasting was part of Christian institutions. But then over time, they kind of gradually observed that there's always a certain risk associated with feasting. It may be good for kind of getting people together and enjoying good atmosphere, but there's always a risk of someone saying a bad thing and someone getting offended and people getting into struggles. And so they gradually dropped the feasting and generally the commensality from their institutions. And I think that's interesting for my model as well, because it shows what happens when you move a certain value to the center of your attention. So by really focusing on harmony, obviously you start discovering all sorts of ways in which further improvements could be made to your way of life, right? If you think about people who become vegetarians or otherwise very committed to the environment, they also start discovering all sorts of small changes which they can make. And that, of course, is what Weber would think of as value rationalization. So you move a value to the center of your concern and then you restructure your life accordingly. And so that's what happened here. But it's also interesting to note how in doing so, the value of harmony transformed. So I told you in the beginning that harmony is not just about the lack of conflict, according to the pre-Christian understanding, but also about these convivial, friendly interactions. And what happens in the Christian way of life is that it becomes increasingly just about a lack of conflict, and these friendly, convivial relations get dropped due to the threat they pose to social harmony. And again, I think that's something one will often see, that values change their nature a little bit if you try to realize them very fully and try to move a subordinate one to the center of the attention. Okay, and that brings me to my conclusion. So the basic idea you'll have gotten, I was trying to talk about value pluralism as a driver of ethical change. And I said that value pluralism creates particular problems in human life, like the agony of choice or the unfulfilled longing to see a certain value not fully realized. And I outlined two models of how that can lead to change by setting people on a quest for unity or by setting people on a quest for the fuller realization of the subordinate value. And so in each case, you have a reorganization on the level of values, which then has ramifications on the level of practice. That is how ethical life changes, right? If you change the values, much else is going to change. Okay, maybe in closing, two clarifications are in order. So the first one is that I'm not suggesting any sort of historical necessity, as it were, whereby subordinate values necessarily are going to push into the foreground. Whether they do depends on all sorts of factors, and that's up to ethnographic analysis. Nor am I suggesting that people will always want to overcome value conflicts. So James Laidlaw, for instance, has stressed that in certain places, keeping conflicting values in play is seen as a way to demonstrate moral maturity, right? By having to negotiate value conflicts to show that you're a mature person. So not everywhere are people going to try to resolve this. The second clarification is that the model that I'm proposing here is open, not closed. And by that, I mean that it is not a sort of Leachian model where you have this oscillation between Gumza and Dumba, right? Where a kind of system always alternates between two states. But you have a system which is open in the sense that, as we saw, by realizing certain values for fully new conflicts appear, and these will then require yet further responses. So it's a kind of open model that I'm offering. Okay, so all in all, I hope to have convinced you that if you're at all interested in studying change, it might be productive for you to look at different values and to consider how the tensions between those values drive forward the life of the people you study. Thank you.
Okay, so we can start. Thank you very much, Julian. We can start the discussion here. So everybody who has a question and who's not in this room can just write the question in the chat, or as Janki said, just write Q for question and a very short summary so that Roland Hardenberg can see and organize the discussion, and I will look for questions in the room. Thank you.
So there are two questions from two people in the chat. Shall we start off with that, or are there any questions in the?
Okay. Yeah, okay.
Oh, sorry.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I will read out the questions by Wakunida. He has posted 3 questions. I'll read out all 3, but maybe Julian, you can also just answer to one, so we have enough time for all other questions. So Wakunida asks, what is the difference between ethical change and cultural change? The second question is, Don Donham talked about the same changes in the context of converting into Christianity among the Male. How is your work different from his? And the third question by Wakunida is it possible to draw a clear line between pre-Christian and Christian liveways?
Right, okay, thank you. That's a really great question. I'll start with the last one because that is an easy one. I mean, that's not my distinction, but I'm basically just repeating how people themselves present things. So they have a very clear sense of there being profound differences. And I think that analytically also one can embrace that view precisely for the reason that we have these changes on the level of values, right? So it's not a kind of random statement that I'm making, but one can systematically say that you have two different groups because the organizing values are different. How does ethical change relate to cultural change? I suppose in the end, those are just definitional matters by talking about ethical change. I was trying to speak specifically about what is important to people, what matters. And cultural change, I suppose, could be a change on the level of meanings or symbols, which isn't always necessarily connected to people's ideas about what sort of life is worth living, at least in terms of how cultural change has been treated in the history of anthropological work. So by talking about ethical change, I try to foreground issues of importance. Now, with regard to Don, yeah, that's a great question. I think those are different theoretical orientations. I mean, Don obviously works from a sort of power framework and conceives of those the conversion of the Mali people in terms of juniors, for instance, trying to liberate themselves from seniors in order to get more access to certain